Okay. Thanks, Sarah. Good evening, and thanks for tuning in tonight. We have Mr. Tom Origer with us this evening, and his talk is entitled True Stories About Hotter Aspects of California Archaeology. Birth, thirsting for water, small and young versus big and older, moving down the river. It's mine and you can't have it. Can pebbles tell us who lived where? These and other stories will cause you to think about who, what, why, when, and is this for me? Tom Origer's interest in prehistory began about 1965, when, as a teenager, he would often find pieces of obsidian, projectile points, and groundstone on the family farm. His formal education started in 1969 at Santa Rosa Junior College, taking a course in local archaeology. Tom transferred to Sonoma State College, where he obtained his BA degree in anthropology, and he received his MA from San Francisco State. Tom started as an adjunct faculty member at Santa Rosa JC in 1979, teaching the course that got his professional training started 10 years earlier. He helped establish the Obsidian Hydration Lab at Sonoma State. He started his own CRM firm, and he served on the board of the Society for California Archaeology for 3 years, from 1997 to 2000. He retired from teaching in 2009 after 30 years at Santa Rosa JC, and he's still kicking, doing archaeology, and still enjoying it. We're glad you're still kicking, Tom. Thanks for coming to present for us tonight. So hit your unmute button.
Go.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, that's good. Now I'm gonna get this going.
Share your screen.
Oh, share screen. Yep.
Click. Share.
Too many buttons.
PowerPoint. Oops.
All right. Now, can you hear me? Anybody? Pat, can you hear me? You can. And you can see the slide. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so Pat said all the appropriate things in terms of introducing me and about the topic. And subsequent to me submitting that for you folks, things might have morphed a little bit. So you're seeing a different title here now, but it's all kind of going to be about the same thing. All right, so birth of obsidian. Comes out of the ground as molten magma. This is an aerial view from Google Earth of Medicine Lake Highland up in Modoc County. And the arrow that is pointing here is showing where the material is actually burping up out of the ground. It's flowing down along this line, and then there's some other lines over here. You can see it going off into the forest. This older section of darker material with the label 1 on it is overlain by this younger material that is flowing on top of it. And then notice this patch of white here. We'll come back to that later. Here's a shot up in the mountains looking down on the lava flow. You can see it here. You can see there's one back here in the forest running out here. All that's various forms of lava and mostly obsidian. Pretty much a mountain of obsidian here. This is one of the flows. You can see all the material that's chunks of obsidian coming down off the slope. Another shot a little closer. This one with my son down here in the lower right corner for scale. He's a lot bigger now, but the obsidian's still the same. Some sources are a lot less noticeable, like this one has a lot of vegetation on it, but it's pretty similar in a lot of ways, close-up shot. You see a lot of obsidian in there. And of course, the woodland detritus, the twigs and the leaves, and some poison oak in the lower right corner there. Moving on, this is another location up near Modoc Glass Mountain called Grasshopper Flat. It's a well-known obsidian source that spread widely across Northern California. A close-up of a boulder of obsidian there that's being worked on or has been worked on in the past with a lot of debitage around it. Okay, so that's the obsidian kind of getting born in a sense. So archaeological life, and what I'm referring to there is we archaeologists and native peoples who use the obsidian, you know, what has this obsidian done while it's been out there and available? So we like to know what the obsidian sources are, that is where it came from. And so there's a couple of different ways that we use to figure that out. One of them is X-ray fluorescence. It's very accurate. It looks at the chemicals, some of the trace elements in the obsidian. So each source is loaded with distinctive elements. And it's a good way to go. It's the best way to go. But if you're going for cheap and you want to do a lot of specimens, then you can do macroscopic characterization, which most people frown on. I frown on it. But with some sources, you could be pretty accurate in identifying what the source is. Blah, blah, blah. XRF, it's real science oriented. There's lots of math, lots of looking at the elements that are there. Periodic table that you probably were exposed to in high school or maybe college, I was, meant nothing to me way back when. Now it does. And macroscopic attributes, take some skill to get it right. So things that we look for are the light that passes through the obsidian when we hold it up. So this is its translucency. This piece, not very translucent at all. It's very opaque, no light's coming through it. Here's a piece that's somewhere intermediary where light is coming through it. And we look at the reflected light, and that's the light that bounces off of the obsidian, so it's surface. So here's a piece, really glossy, but loaded with lots of vesicles, phenocrysts, and things that basically make it a little harder to work this because it's less predictable what you're going to get when you nap it. Another piece, same kind of stuff, only this has got some mahogany mixed in it, and it's not quite as black. Another piece that has kind of a grainy surface. And then this piece here has a very smooth, shiny surface. Those three that I showed you there, disregarding the color, but whether there's phenocryst or it has kind of a grainy surface or a real smooth surface like this, are really good attributes for the local obsidians in the northwest part of California, just north of San Francisco Bay. So something else that we like to do besides figuring out where the obsidian came from, which tells us something about where people were getting their obsidian and who they might have been interacting with, or at least how far they had to travel to get it if they weren't doing it via exchange, is we like to try to date the obsidian. So obsidian hydration dating is something that I deal with quite a lot. So this is an image of a hydration band. We make thin sections out of the obsidian. So we have a cross section of the piece and we can see the outer edge and we can see how deeply the moisture has soaked into the obsidian. And based on the thickness of the band, if we know what the rate of hydration is, we can then determine how long it has been since this piece was napped or the surfaces were created. This slide I throw in here because I like it, in that it's got some bubbles or vesicles that are inside the obsidian, but near the surface of the obsidian. And on this particular one, right in here, there's a crack that goes out to the surface that let moisture inside this vesicle. And you can see that it's got a hydration band running around on the inside of the bubble. This one over here doesn't have hydration on the inside, so it didn't have some route for moisture to come in from the outside and get inside of it. So it's kind of a rare thing, and I throw this in here just because it's different. So with projectile points, we like to know how old they are, and a lot of them are temporal indicators based on their style. And one of the first things we did when we started the hydration lab at Sonoma State was we took a suite of projectile points, we measured the hydration on them, and then we looked to see if the hydration made sense from the perspective, did we have thin bands on lake points, such as this guy, and did we have thicker bands on points like this one over here with the concave base, which we would say is an older style. Here's another one there. Here's one that's been beat up and reused quite a bit. So what happened when we measured the hydration on these things? And this is what we got. So the thickness of the hydration is on the scale running left to right, and time would go this way. So we would say these are the youngest points. These are the oldest type. These are in between. And we can see that these have thinner hydration bands and these have thicker hydration bands. And there's some overlap in here between, you know, these two sets, and there's some overlap here and some overlap there. And that's normal from my perspective. It's the story I like to tell is that every year new cars come out, but we don't all go out and buy a brand new car each year. We use older cars until they finally give up, and then we get a new one. So you're going to have some overlap between, you know, the newfangled projectile point as opposed to the older style that predated it. So there's always going to be some overlap, and that's normal. So that's projectile points. Then we get a bunch of debitage. So we've got all these flakes. What can we do with a bunch of flakes? You know, they're not distinctive kinds of things. They're just flakes. So one of my colleagues a number of years ago, gosh, it's probably 40 years ago now, he took data on flakes that from a number of sites that have been dug in the Santa Rosa area. So Santa Rosa in Sonoma County is right in here. Sebastopol's over here. So this lighter area is the Santa Rosa Plain. The darker is the hillier country around the plain. And the squares and circles here are the archaeological sites from which he was able to get hydration data. So there's kind of wasn't scientifically drawn bunch of information. It was just information that was in reports from various sites that have been dug, mostly as a result of planned development. And so testing and mitigation of impacts kind of work. So CRM. So this is the a map showing the hydration that's the oldest for the area. And you can see these three sites with the dark circles in them yielded pretty good amounts of measurements for the old period. So, but not a lot going on. You can see most of the sites, there's really nothing showing up there. So then we come a little closer in time, and we lost that site over in this area, but we've now got 4 sites where there's a fair amount of obsidian production going on. And we move even closer to the present, and now we've got 6 sites showing here. Again, not all the sites have any amount of napping going on, but we're getting more as we get closer to the present. And we get to this time. This is about 1,000 years ago. This is when the bow and arrow have come into the area. So we've got lots of smaller projectile points, and we have lots of occupation going on. Pretty much all the sites, and there's a cluster down here, are places where a fair amount of, if not a lot of napping is taking place of the obsidian. And then about 500 years ago, so this would get us into the upper or late emergent, depending on where you are, you might have a little different language, but late in time. And this is what happens. Hardly any napping is going on now. A lot of sites just, it drops out. And his speculation at the time was, well, maybe groups of people from these sites are aggregating at certain sites, and so the other ones are just being abandoned, and just a smaller number of sites are being occupied. And he also was looking at it from the perspective of this is all going on about 500, 450 years ago. And that's a time when things are going really bad down in Mexico and Central America in terms of native peoples being conquered by Europeans, and Europeans bringing in disease potentially brought in diseases that then spread across the landscape all the way up into this particular area. And it might be that there's just a major population decline. More recently, Janine, my much better half, did her thesis on obsidian in Sonoma County, and she was inspired a little bit by what Paul, who had done this other study 40 years ago, did, only she expanded the area that she was going to look at. And so you can see in this table over here on the left, the different geographical areas that she looked at. And then she's got the hydration measurements, and based on time periods. And you'll see that there's pretty consistent increases all along here, which is very similar to what Paul saw in terms of obsidian production increasing over time. But if you get over here now to the upper emergent, you can see there's a drop in almost all cases. There's only one instance, this one here in the area of Sonoma, where there's not a drop, but in all other cases, there's a drop, which is very similar to what Paul saw. So where Paul's data was based on just several dozen measurements, Janine's here is based on well over 1,000.
10,000.
Oh, okay. She's telling me now 10,000. Yeah, I guess if we add all these numbers up, it would be. There's no total here. Yeah, so scads and scads of measurements. A really good, healthy sample. And again, why there's this decrease late in time, we don't know the answer yet. But in archaeology, if we knew the answer to everything that we ask questions about, then we'd put ourselves out of business. Okay, so next little story here, big versus small specimens. Typically, when we do hydration analysis, fairly large pieces, and I'm going to say things as big as a dime or maybe even larger, are most convenient for doing hydration analysis of. They're easy to hold, they're easy to cut, to get the sample out of. There's just a lot of good reasons why larger pieces are good to do. But small pieces should not be ignored. So a site, Yola 139, we did some work at it a number of years ago because it was going to be on the shoreline of a newly constructed reservoir and it was going to suffer from wave action. We dug there, we recovered hundreds of corner notch projectile points. And the initial batch of hydration that we did, about 350 specimens were corner notch points. And we did a lot of hydration on debitage. What we got was that 75% of the measurements were old and only 22% were fairly young. And when I say young, I mean in the range of they should match up with the corner notch projectile points. Where we had hundreds of points, it was kind of clear that we didn't have very much in the way of small hydration measurements that would be coeval with those points. So one of the conclusions that we were mulling over, or our thoughts, was that perhaps these projectile points are being made someplace else and being brought as complete items to the site. And so there was no reason to produce a bunch of little late period flakes while making those points, because the points were already made. So then we thought, well, maybe we better look at some of the little tiny flakes and see what they tell us. And so we looked at the little flakes, and we'll skip this middle part for the moment and come down here. So these are the small flakes. So things that were greater than 6 millimeters. Oops, we've only got 23%, but of the little tiny flakes, we've now got 77% of the flakes showing up there. So you can contrast this up here where we did the larger flakes. It turned out the larger flakes were just old ones, and the tiny flakes generally are much younger. So these are the little flakes that are coming off of these 350 some odd corner notch projectile points. So if we hadn't done this down here and we only did this up here, we would have come to some bad conclusions probably, regarding how obsidian was moving across the landscape, in what form, and what was happening to it when it got to the site where it was being used. And so here's just a larger lanceolate point. You can see I've outlined this one flake scar. It's pretty healthy sized. You can see there's more that are pretty big. There's a few small ones along the edges. And then this small projectile point, that's about its biggest flake scar, which is smaller than this one here, which is kind of average maybe for this specimen. But then there's scads and scads and scads of little tiny flakes. And so those little flakes are what are being produced when this thing is being manufactured and or resharpened, whatever's happening to it later in life. So if you ignore all these little tiny flakes that came off of this, as witnessed by these flake scars, then your hydration is going to be all messed up, because you're going to miss that time period. Okay, rolling down the river. So a couple of years ago, we were taking a pretty hard look at a bunch of debitage at a site down in Napa, and we were seeing that were lots and lots and lots of pebbles of obsidian that were water-worn pebbles that were in the site, and those pebbles were being broken and they were being used. We don't know what they were making with them, because the pebbles were pretty small. We're talking things that are like quail egg size, smaller than a chicken egg for sure. So, but they're breaking up these pebbles. We then expanded our study area down along the Napa Valley here. The town of Napa, or city of Napa, is right in here. And this goes all the way up to Calistoga, which is up towards the north end of the valley. And we wanted to look at the archaeological sites along here to see what was the frequency of pebbles that were being used, pebbles that were coming out of the Napa River, flowing down the river, coming from the source at Glass Mountain, or whatever other source was feeding the river, and these pebbles were washing down and being used by local peoples. One of the questions that came up in looking at who the people were that were out there is, we got different folks giving different ideas as to where the boundaries were between groups. So down in this area, we're looking at Patwin, which are folks that came in from the southern end of Sacramento Valley. And then north up the valley, we've got Wapo, which is the most recent group there. And they have great time depth, though, in the area. They're Yukian speakers, and they have the greatest time depth, actually. So there's difference of opinion as to where boundaries are. And so we were looking to see what the distribution of pebbles was, thinking that maybe the people who are intruding into the area are going to have less access to the source, which is up this direction. And as a consequence, because they don't have as easy access to this, because they've, in a sense, irked these people who were residing in this area and pushed them out, is then they decided to collect the pebbles of obsidian from the river and use those as their source. So tables are things that are really nasty to have in these kind of documents or these presentations, but bear with me for a moment here. These two columns are the most important. So we're looking at the kind of cortex that's on the obsidian. So quarry cortex is stuff that is straight from the quarry, hasn't been tumbled in the river or in any of the creeks. And then there's this water-worn cortex, and these are the pebbles that are washing down. And you can see these up here, relatively low percentages of water-worn cortex. And these are pieces that are north of Yountville. So let me go back for a second here. So Yountville is this area right in here. So up in this area and further north, doesn't seem to be, based on these percentages, a lot of use of pebbles. But when you get down here, the percentages of pebbles that are being broken in these archaeological sites, which again, if I go back, are this area down here around Napa, it looks like the people around Napa who are also late in time are the people who are coming in, pushing the Wapo back up to the north. So that's what that table, and forget all the rest of that stuff. You can look at it if you want, but it's going away now. So when we look at the quarry cortex, in the northern part of the valley, there's a very high percentage of the cortex is just straight from the quarry, and a low percentage is water worn. But when you get down in the southern part of the valley, that is from Yountville down, you can see quarry cortex drops way down, but water worn cortex increases like crazy. So they're using a lot of the pebbles here. It's kind of weird. I think this was suspicious that these numbers all ended up being the same, but I went over them twice and that's the way they are. So I didn't cook the data. That's just dumb luck that it came out that way. Okay, so death of obsidian. So there's no real death of obsidian. It just transforms into other stuff. So I mentioned on that one slide earlier where I was showing the lava flows and I said, there's, this white area. So remember that. This is that white area. In the background, this is the flow of obsidian coming out of the place where it's burping up out of the earth up over here, flowing down and going off into the forest. So this white area is an area that's being mined. And the stuff that is here is called perlite. And if you do anything with gardening, then you've probably run into perlite. It's the white little specks of stuff that is often in the soil that looks kind of like little pieces of styrofoam, but it's crunchy little stuff, and it's obsidian, or was obsidian. So if you take that white stuff and you heat it up a lot, it expands and makes those little chunky things that you find in soil mixes. It's also used in making lightweight concrete and quite a lot of other things in construction. Bag of perlite, you can go down to any store that's got plants and stuff and they'll sell you perlite. That's formerly obsidian. So a couple of years ago, we had a fire over at Napa Glass Mountain, aptly named the Glass Fire because it burned over a lot of Napa Glass Mountain. And so we got out there after the fire to see what was exposed. And one of the things that we saw lots of are these white things. So see where I've got the cursor. This is a 50-cent piece for scale. This is another white thing. There's little bits of white things scattered around here. Those are pieces of obsidian that got heated up enough, like these kinds of temperatures in the fire, and turned into big chunks of perlite in essence. There's a piece just by itself. And when you look at it, you go, nah, I think Tom's pulling our leg. That's not obsidian. It doesn't look like it. Looks like a wasp nest or something. But then in this shot, this is the obsidian, and this is where this part of it was sticking up. This was probably buried. This was sticking up out of the ground. The heat from the fire went over it and puffed it up and turned it into a big wad of perlite. Okay, so it isn't really the end. It's pretty much the end of what I'm going to show in pictures here. So the end for now, or to be continued. I'm going to dump these pictures now if I can. How do I get rid of these? Janine? Should I hit delete?
No.
Escape. Okay. All right. Can you guys still hear me? Now you can see me. All right, good. So the few stories that I've told here are among a bunch of stories about obsidian, and in a sense, they relate to archaeology. Archaeology is driven by asking questions, and a lot of times when we ask questions, it spins off into even more questions for us to deal with. And often we get answers, but sometimes we just get more questions, and then we've got more trails to chase to try to get more answers. And as I said earlier, if we answered all of our questions, then we'd kind of be out of business in doing obsidian, doing obsidian studies, doing anything in archaeology, because we would have all the answers. So we'll never probably have all the answers to archaeology. So that just keeps us going, doing what we do. And as far as I'm concerned, this is probably one of the funnest things to do with your career, whatever your career is going to be. Any questions?
Does anybody have any questions for Tom?
Hey, Tom, have you found
Yes, sir.
any perlite on sites from near hearths or anything, or do they just don't get hot enough?
I have never seen any, and I've never heard anybody talk about it. So I think, Glenn, that it just must not get hot enough. And even on the quarries, I've been on a lot of quarries. This is the first time I've ever seen that stuff. I've seen it from other fires that other people have sent to me and sent me pictures of, but this is the first time that I've seen it locally. So the fire must have been incredibly hot. And some of the pieces were 7-8 inches across, really great big pieces. Must have been a good sized chunk of obsidian when it got cooked.
How is the perceived accuracy of obsidian around the state now?
In terms of like hydration dating,
Yes.
that's a good question, Rob. And I'm going to say it must be pretty good because we get tons and tons and tons of people sending obsidian specimens in for hydration purposes. So, and
Has
it,
anybody
maybe
done
they
it?
don't believe it, but the contract calls for it. So they do it because it's the Forest Service or Caltrans or somebody says they got to do it.
Nobody's done a study on that recently?
No, I've not seen anything recently. So I think just to backtrack a little bit to expand for others, Rob will know this, but maybe some of the younger people won't. But when hydration first came along, it was back in the 60s, and it was thought to be, kind of a wonder drug in terms of a way to date archaeology. And so a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon and were doing it or having specimens submitted and done. And then there was a lot of failure, a lot of disappointed people who said, nah, this doesn't work at all. It's not good. And so it went through a period of decline, and then it came back up again, and it stayed up pretty well. And I think part of the problem was that people believed that they could do stuff that it couldn't do. And we discovered that there were some problems with some of the early research. For instance, there was a person back east who was creating induced hydration in the lab. That is, he was pressure cooking the obsidian to make it hydrate fast. And he had rates that he developed, but when you use those rates to calculate dates, your dates were way too old. When you knew that the feature that you were dating or the items you were dating weren't that old, they were coming back really, really old. And the problem that was not realized was a problem was that by cooking the obsidian in these stainless steel vessels in these furnaces, and that's kind of a simple description of it, but the environment in there was eating the obsidian surface. And so while you were building hydration, you were eating the surface of the obsidian off. And so your hydration zone or band was thinner than it should have been because it was being eroded away. And so you'd have these thin bands, and you would think, well, okay, thin band equals old, because that's what the rate calculation said. And so when you dated a projectile point that you knew was maybe 600 years old and it came back 3,000 years old, then you knew hydration sucked. Well, it wasn't that hydration didn't work. It was we didn't understand the process of doing induced hydration so that we could avoid that problem. So that was part of the reason for the decline, I think, is we just didn't know what we were doing. But we have much better ideas now about how to create laboratory hydration and develop rates that are much, much better. They're way more reasonable, and it, in my opinion, works very often. So one of the things we did with induced hydration is because the obsidian is in this stainless steel vessel with a cooling coil and a bunch of other metal things, and with distilled water or deionized water in there, it was creating a bath that was bad for the obsidian. It was corroding the obsidian. So now we use a glass liner inside the stainless steel vessel. There's a little tube that goes down into the water that measures temperature, which controls the oven that this stuff is cooking in, and that's metal. Well, now we have a test tube that we slide up over that, kind of like a condom, and then that keeps that metal from being in the solution. And so right now the obsidian is not in contact with any kind of metal. It's just in water, and water that's been buffered with some silica gel, which is what obsidian is, silica. So it's not being corroded anymore, and we get full hydration bands compared to what was being done years ago.
Well, I'm of course particularly interested in the Scotts Valley site because I'm redoing the display for the city of Scotts Valley. And his work was done in the late 80s. He published in 90, and he had like 72 obsidian hydration dates over the whole area that seemed to work with the carbon-14 dates and the other stuff. Would that still be considered good now?
That's a good question, and I will go back to my lab tomorrow, my office, and I just had the report out, Scotts Valley report, and I was looking at that. I'm going to look at that again, and I'm going to look at the advances that we've made since that time, and I'll get back to you on that.
Thank you, Tom. I'd appreciate that.
It may be that we'll have a different way of dating that obsidian now.
Okay.
Hopefully
Good
not.
deal.
I mean, if it worked good for you before, hopefully we don't mess it up. But it's going to be what it's going to be. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question, Tom. I'm wondering, has there been any advancement on the study of sort of rehydration? We have fire effects that wipe out hydration bands, and
Yeah.
there's always been the question about whether it rehydrates and what rate it rehydrates. Has there been any good studies that have sort of started to look at that?
We did some work on that years ago. We had a session at one of the SCA meetings. It was the equivalent of a day-long session, and Janine did a study looking at rehydration. And as far as I know, that's the only thing that exists on that, and it's something that needs to be done. Unfortunately, she's got work to do, and we all have too much work to do. We need grant money or something to give us the funds so that we can study those things. But that is something that should be done. But the results, for those of you who don't know, showed that if the fire wasn't too hot, in a sense, hot enough to remove the hydration layer so we couldn't see it, but not so hot that it really burned the obsidian badly, that given a fairly short period of time, that obsidian would rehydrate, and the space in the obsidian that formerly had the water molecules in it would just suck up water again and quickly fill it in, and the hydration bands would come back. And when I say quickly, I don't really know how long that would happen in nature, but in archaeology, or not in archaeology, but in the lab, we could make it do it in hours. And we could have pieces that had hydration on them. We can cook them in the kiln and get rid of the hydration. Then we can put them back in what we affectionately refer to as the bombs, and cook them and put hydration right back in them, lickety split. If we took pieces and we cooked them at high temperatures for a long time and then put them back in the bombs, they did not hydrate really quickly. They would hydrate at a normal rate as though they were freshly hydrating all over again. But they didn't hydrate as quickly as those that were cooked at lower temperatures or burned at lower temperatures. So the short answer is that old study is the only study that I'm aware of. But it's something that somebody should do. Maybe this would be a good thing for somebody to think about the Benninghoff Award and get some bucks there. Because that's been expanded now to not just be students, but anybody. And I think it's opened up more topics in a sense. So look at the latest newsletter, become a member, and go for the bucks. And you get a bunch of hydration and a bunch of sourcing. So it's all good, useful stuff if you're interested in obsidian.
Oh, thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions for Tom? Well, thank you so much, Tom. I see people giving you a round of applause. Let's everybody
All right.
Send some appreciation his way. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody learned a lot about the perlite and the trade routes in Napa, and that was very insightful. Thank you. And just again, remind you all, our next speaker event is January 12th with Michael Groen from State Parks. He's who took Hilkema's place, Mark Hilkema's place. So it'll be interesting to see what he has to say. And yeah, we will see you all next month. And thanks for coming.
Am I still on? Can
Yeah,
still
you have
hear me?
something else to say?
Yeah, I want to close with, so this was kind of a whirlwind little tour of just a small little bit of the world of obsidian that I mess around with. And I want to say that at this year's upcoming annual meeting, I'm going to be doing 2 talks on obsidian. And so some of the things I just touched on, I'm going to go into a lot more depth. So if this was too lightweight, you can come in and I'll throw up a whole bunch of formulas and crud that'll put you to sleep, which I won't do. I don't
Cool,
believe in
thank
that.
you.
So anyhow, I'm on the docket to do a couple of presentations. So if you like obsidian or want to know a little bit more, then put me down on your agenda.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, thank you for letting me do this. I'm sorry I didn't go longer, but I'm worn out. I've got an old sick dog that keeps me up late at night, and this is past my normal bedtime. So thank you.
Thanks so much for
This was
joining us.
fun.
Thank you, Tom.
Sure. Night.
Have a good
All
night,
right.
everybody.